and I call the Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks very much, Speaker. I don't know who that bloke was, but he's very entertaining. Very entertaining. And I'll keep coming back in when he's there to hear someone who's come into a 7-year-old government that has never turned a surplus, that has racked up the highest deficit and debt in the history of the nation, while promising that it was going to deliver a surplus in its first year and every year after that. To come in with that, I reckon he's pretty amusing. And so I hope he's back, and when he's back I'll be here and I'll be ready with the motion for an extension of time. Because the other thing that is very easily forgotten, and when you listen to the speeches of the government here, I'm not sure anyone on their side has acknowledged the fact that they were dragged to having a wage subsidy. That we on the floor of the parliament were calling for them to establish a wage subsidy at the exact same point they said the only answer was to push people onto the welfare system. So the position of the government, let's not forget, their initial only response was JobSeeker to be increased, and it wasn't until they saw the enormity of the outcome with the Centrelink queues, having mocked our suggestion and our recommendation, our constructive suggestion of a wage subsidy, that they then were eventually dragged there. So when we hear them say how important it is to support those businesses, yes, that's why we argued for it even when the government was ridiculing the idea. When they say it's important to keep the relationship between an employer and their workers, yes, that's why we called for it. And when they mock the relationship with the union movement, well, do they forget that it was the union movement in Australia that was first to be calling for a wage subsidy? We joined those calls, eventually employers joined those calls, and the last to the party were the members of the government. So I'm glad that they're there now, but please don't pretend that something that they opposed here on the floor of the House is somehow a core principle of being a member of this government, because it wasn't when they were knocking out the idea. So we argued for them to introduce a wage subsidy, they rejected it, and then they got there. We then argued that it had to be extended because if the economy was heading towards a cliff in September that was going to result in mass unemployment, that was going to result in mass closures of businesses if the tap of JobKeeper was turned off in one hit. They rejected that for a long time, and now they have come to the view, yes, you do need to continue it. They also rejected the concept, when they're there wanting to talk about the signing of cheques and the throwing of money away, they rejected the concept that a wage subsidy should be a subsidy rather than an increase, and that it shouldn't be the case that somebody who's still living at home with working one shift a week suddenly got $750 a week. There were better ways to target taxpayers' money. But that was an argument made by Labor. The signing of the cheques and the throwing of money away was the decision of the government. So one of the reasons that it's interesting to hear the member who spoke before me, who I'm told is a member of the parliament, is that everything he pointed to was inaccurate. Everything. Everything. And not many people can deliver that. So full marks, well done. But on each of those issues, the characterisation that he was pointing to and wanting to ridicule was a characterisation of his own party at the beginning of this crisis, because everything that he referred to was the exact position that he was calling out here for when the Prime Minister was articulating it about 2 metres from where I stand now. So we also warned the government that they shouldn't be extending the emergency industrial relations powers to businesses that had fully recovered. So only a week ago, the position of the government, and this is where we get to, and I should explain, as well as the JobKeeper payment itself, there are changes that have been made to the Fair Work Act. Now, there were two different pathways that this could have been done, either by using the Industrial Commission, where the trade union movement was already working cooperatively to make some variations, or to make changes through the Fair Work Act. We preferred the former because it was a more flexible way. The government ended up deciding that they would do it through the Fair Work Act, and we've been constructive with that. That then needs to be extended, and the reason for that flexibility is JobKeeper can't work without there being either flexibility through the Commission or flexibility through the Fair Work Act. And the reason for that's really simple. Some people will receive the wage subsidy and have received the wage subsidy and have continued to work their normal hours, and the wage subsidy helps the employer pay part of their wage. There are other people where the employer was in a position to not be able to pay their wage at all, and you couldn't expect someone to keep working a 38-hour week if that then meant a cut in their hourly rate with the $750 JobKeeper payment. So the only way you could make this operational was to have, either through the Commission or through changes to the Fair Work Act, those sorts of flexibilities. So as well as the extension of the payments, that's the Treasury part of the bill, that the member for Rankin's already responded to on behalf of the opposition, you also have the Fair Work changes, and they go in two parts. The first of them is the extension of the exact sort of flexibility that I just described, so that people who are still on the JobKeeper payment, that if it's being used, so that where the employer would effectively be cutting their rate of pay if they were continuing to work their normal hours, that they can reduce their hours down to the rate of the JobKeeper payment and do so without breaching other workplace conditions. It's therefore a very practical measure, and we supported it last time. We support its extension this time. The government then said they wanted to extend this flexibility for people who were no longer receiving JobKeeper. Now, might I say, this is a complete shift from what we were told when we first supported the Fair Work changes. We were told the only reason the government wanted these sorts of changes was to make the JobKeeper payment operational. Now we discover they want those same flexibilities to continue for workplaces that used to be on JobKeeper and are no longer. So we have shifted from a circumstance where it was simply to make the payments operational to an argument from the government that part of the recovery is, they say, on a temporary basis to cut some of the conditions of workers in Australia. That's a big shift. That's a really big shift. Now, there's been a few different elements to it. On one of them, the government has backed down, and I want to welcome that. Only a week ago, the government was arguing that any business that used to be on JobKeeper should, if they fall off JobKeeper because their business has improved, they should retain the rights to be able to reduce the terms and conditions of employment for their workforce. And that included companies that were now trading better than they were 12 months ago. It included businesses that have been recording profits after having a long period of having the wages of their workforce paid by the taxpayer. And the government was going to give all of them this extended flexibility. Now, they have backed down on that, and we welcome that. So where the so-called legacy payments are now are for companies that are no longer eligible for JobKeeper but are still recording a 10% downturn from the year before. Now, that is a better position than what the government had a week ago. The position they had a week ago was ridiculous. The position they have now is still problematic, and I want to explain why. First of all, let's clarify exactly what businesses we're talking about. The thresholds for JobKeeper are different depending on whether your turnover is more than $1 billion or less than $1 billion a year. If your turnover is more than $1 billion a year, then you've had to qualify for JobKeeper, have a 50% downturn. If you are less than $1 billion a year in your turnover, you had to have a 30% downturn. So depending on the size of the business, we're talking about businesses that used to receive JobKeeper, no longer do because either a big business has gone over the 50% threshold or a medium-sized or small business has gone over the 30% threshold, but they're still 10% down on where they were before. They're the companies we're talking about. And what the government is saying is they want those businesses to retain the right to effectively reduce the terms and conditions of employment for their workforce for the period that this amendment would last. Now, when the government says those businesses are still struggling, yep, they've got a downturn. We don't dispute that. But let's be clear. These are businesses that are doing well enough that the government has decided that the government will not support them any longer. These are businesses where the government has made a decision that, yeah, they're still struggling a bit, but they're doing well enough that they no longer deserve support from the government. And yet, even though the government has decided they don't need support from the government, they've also decided that that need to support these businesses should be transferred from the government to the worker. And these sorts of flexibilities, the government will often talk about the one about being able to direct someone to do other duties than what they'd normally do. But here's the big one that you rarely hear the government talk about. It allows somebody to reduce the hours of employment. So it was one thing when you were doing that with JobKeeper because it was to enable JobKeeper. Now we're talking about the government giving workplaces that the government has already decided aren't doing bad enough to warrant $1 of extra support from the government, that they should have a right to tell a full-time worker that you're now part-time for this period. Now, it will often be the case where there is a real circumstance, and unions, workers, employers deal with this every day, where there will be mutual agreement that that the employer is in a situation where they can't keep everybody on and people will say, well, I'll agree to cut my hours so that it can work for everybody. These sorts of mutual agreements happen every day. That's not what this legislation does, though. This is not about mutual agreement. This is about the employer being able to make the decision. Now, there are some things that the government has put in following consultation with unions and others, which are better than where I suspect they started, and I acknowledge those. There's a consultation period now. There's an appeal that a worker can make to the Industrial Commission. But that doesn't change the core of what we are being asked to enable. And we are being asked to enable a circumstance where a business that the government has decided is no longer worthy of financial support from this government will have the right to cut a worker's hours to 60% of what they already were. Now, let's have a think about how this works in the real world, particularly for people who are on modest wages. So if you're on the minimum wage is $753 a week. If you're on the minimum wage, because previously you could only be cut to the JobKeeper rate, you could only be taking a pay cut if you're a full-timer on the minimum wage of $3 a week, or to be precise, $3.80 a week. But now, because you don't have JobKeeper as the reference point, because you couldn't be taken below the JobKeeper rate, and the government may not have thought this implication through. So I want to give them the chance to look at this and work this through, because this one is a real problem. A 40% reduction for a worker on the minimum wage means that they would lose $300 a week. So where previously someone on the minimum wage, under what we put through the parliament last time on the Fair Work amendments, they could have a $3 pay cut. Now their take-home pay can go down by $300 a week. There are many workers who are paid more than the minimum wage, but not a lot more. A cleaner earns $804.90. A 40% to their hours, a 40% cut, would mean they'd lose around $330 a week, falling below the current JobKeeper rate, falling more than $100 below the new JobKeeper rate. A full-time retail employee, and we've all seen retail workers on the front line, as have been cleaners, on the front line of the people who have been essential workers during this crisis. If you're on the minimum award rate as a full-timer of $813.60 a week, a full-time retail worker, under what's in front of the parliament right now, could lose $325 a week, meaning that they would fall below, obviously falling well below, the current JobKeeper rate, and even under the new JobKeeper rate, falling more than $100 a week short of it. So this creates a situation where a worker, at the time that the business they work for is doing better, will see their pay cut. And the business might only be taking a 10% turnover cut, but the worker could be getting a 40% cut. And the 40% cut, let's not forget, it could actually be much more than that because it's a cut to hours. And if the hours that are cut are hours that attracted penalty rates, then it may be much more than 40% of the take-home pay that a worker loses on this. So this gives rise to two critical issues. The first is the concept of the legacy employers at all is a case the government has not made, and a case the government hasn't made because they haven't wrestled with the one critical issue. They make the argument that these businesses are still doing it tough, and we get that. But they don't make the argument as to why the government is completely withdrawing its support and transferring the full liability onto the workforce. And the government has not made that case. But the second thing is, how can you justify to an employee that as the business they work for is doing better, the parliament has given permission for their take-home pay to go down, and to go down many more times in percentage terms than what the cut to the company's turnover has been? A business suffering a 10% hit, this parliament's being asked to give permission for them to give a 40% hit to their workforce. And the government, in arguing, oh, but the businesses are still doing it tough, isn't answering the question, well, why aren't you offering them support anymore? And if you think, who is the most able to provide support during this time? Is it the workforce or is it the government? Because let's not forget, the workforce has already taken significant cuts during this time. Going down to the JobKeeper rate has kept people in work, and that's good. But it has also meant that a whole lot of people have been putting off other debts, putting off other liabilities. Many of these people have been faced in a circumstance where, because their liabilities have been more than what the JobKeeper rate was providing for them, that they are now in a position where they have no superannuation left. And the government boasting as though that's somehow an act of self-determination on their part. If they've got no other way to get money, then they're in a circumstance where they've raided their retirement, which will be probably one of the biggest examples of intergenerational theft that we will see during this crisis. Because in the future, not only will their retirement, because of the power of accumulation that happens in accumulation accounts, which is why everyone in this room's got one, not only do they lose that, but it also means every other taxpayer then has to increase the liability to support them. Yeah, the deficit that we look at the moment, the debt that we look at the moment, isn't the only liability that the government's sending to the future. The way they're handling superannuation is a huge liability. being sent to the next generation. For the people who have had no choice but to clean out their own accounts, from the people who've seen their accounts raided through other routes, and from every taxpayer who will be left with the liability because of the ideological obsession of members opposite. The pandemic has created certain opportunities for government in terms of a willingness of the public wanting the government to succeed, and that's real. But we are starting to watch the government abuse that trust. We are starting to watch the government use the pandemic as cover for ideological obsessions. And that is what is before us right now. An ideological obsession to increase the power of an employer to reduce someone's hours so that someone who thought they had a full-time job suddenly doesn't, even though the business they work for is recovering. And that ideological obsession being pushed through under the cover of the pandemic, where we were first told it was only to implement JobKeeper, and now we get told, oh, it's only for legacy firms. Does anyone not believe that they'll try to normalise this during this term and say, oh yeah, it's going to be a long recovery, we just need to put this into the Fair Work Act for good? Superannuation, we were told, oh, it was only because of the emergency of that first one-day sitting that we had here in the Parliament. And yesterday, we hear the Prime Minister trying to normalise it by saying, oh yeah, it's your money, use it to pay down your mortgage. Use it to pay down your mortgage. Nothing to do with the pandemic. Yeah. Nothing to do with the pandemic at all. But the Prime Minister now using the pandemic as cover for an ideological obsession to make sure that the only people who end up with superannuation accounts are people on high incomes, like it used to be. Like the so-called good old days, before we ended up with a situation where working people had the audacity to want to have a nest egg of their own. So we've seen it here right now on working hours. We saw it yesterday on superannuation. We've seen it, and I've argued it previously with respect to the minister at the table, with respect to both the Australia Post changes and the Australian content quotas. We are seeing an increasing creep here of the pandemic being used as cover for issues that the government has long wanted to do, and when they come in the first time, they say it's only for an emergency, and then they come in the second time. They come in the second time, and oh yeah, it's only for a little bit longer, and we know where this is heading. And what is in front of us now, you would have to be completely naive to believe that it is only planned to be for the next few months. Because if we were to take the government at their word, then we would trust them that last time it was only there to be able to properly implement the JobKeeper provisions. And of course now, you don't get JobKeeper, but you still have a way of having your hours cut without it having to be by mutual agreement. We know where this is heading. We know where this is heading. We know what the government's up to. And with that in mind, we'll be moving 2 amendments here in the House today. The first is one which we know the government won't agree to. So we get it, but we don't believe they've made the case for the legacy businesses being counted at all. And so we'll have an amendment to take those out. But we know that the government won't agree to that. The second amendment that we will move will be an amendment to give people a safety net. And this is one that the government, and I know they won't be agreeing to it tonight, but can I say this is something the government should consider and work their way through, because there is an anomaly in how they have drafted this that will hit low-paid workers really badly, and I suspect, or I hope, the government simply hadn't thought about how this anomaly would work and that they'd simply worked it through based on people on average earnings, where you go down to 60% of your hours and you're still above the JobKeeper rate. But we can't have a situation where we've given permission for people who work in businesses that are recovering to be being paid that were full-time to now be being paid less than the JobKeeper rate. You can't have a situation where it's actually a worker is better off if their business they work for is more distressed. And as the business is improving, the workforce will be dreading it because the employer is given the new power at that point to cut their hours to below the JobKeeper rate. So the second amendment that we'll be moving, and I get if the government's going to agree to this, it'll take some time, but they really should be agreeing to this. There needs to be a safety net that you cannot have your hours reduced to the extent that you are being paid below the applicable JobKeeper rate. Now, of course, some people would already have hours that are below the JobKeeper rate in terms of the regular hours that they're worked, and if their hours remain where they are, then there's no change. But when these provisions are going to be actioned, they should not be able to be actioned in a way that takes people to below the JobKeeper rate. Think of the counterpoint. Think if the government rejects this amendment and the bill as drafted goes through. This parliament will have voted for people on the minimum wage to be allowed, without their agreement, to get a pay cut of $300 a week. That will be providing support for people on JobKeeper, and as businesses approve, this parliament will have said, as the business improves, it's okay for you to be paid less because your boss is doing better. Now that is an absurd situation. That is what the bill currently says. I dearly hope it's an anomaly that the government has not thought of, and we want to deal constructively with the government in dealing with this. We will move both of those amendments, and I urge the government. I get that they're committed to the legacy case issues. We still oppose it. We'll move the amendment. We know that the government won't agree to that. In terms of there being a safety net, people on high incomes will be unaffected by the safety net because when they go down, if they were to go down to 60% of their normal hours, they'll still be above the JobKeeper rate. But we can't be agreeing to changing the IR system to allow people who, at this time, have been struggling already through the pandemic to be in a circumstance where they then face further cuts because the business they work for is doing better, and cuts that can be so severe that they take them below the JobKeeper rate. So there'll be two amendments, the second of which I just urge the government to consider. All this said, arguments that we made last time JobKeeper was before us are still there and are still problems, and it'd be wrong of me to not refer to them. JobKeeper still excludes more than 1 million casuals. JobKeeper still excludes local government workers. JobKeeper still excludes childcare workers, a very, very large number of arts and entertainment workers, freelancers, university workers. Those people have jobs, pay taxes, and should not be left out in the way that they have been. So we still make that case. We still urge the government to have a wage subsidy that accepts that workers who need help to keep their relationship with their employer should get it. And I don't give up on this for one very simple reason. While the government says no today, a week ago they were saying that companies that had improved their position should be on the legacy list. A few months ago they were still arguing against a wage subsidy altogether. They've been dragged to each of the positions. JobKeeper should cover those who are currently being left behind. And we should not, as a parliament, be voting to allow people on low wages to have $300 a week cut from their take-home pay simply because the business they work for is doing better. It's an absurd situation. I hope it's a mistake. Whether it's a mistake or not, the government should revisit it, just as they've revisited so many other issues on this. because if people don't keep their relationship to their employer and we keep seeing incomes drop, the hit to the country is huge.